today I will tell you something about biotremology of social wasps, which is a neglected communication channel in this group of insects because it has been looked over the last 40 years, but never in a serious way and in a detailed way, I would say. So I will try to sum up what we know so far. Of course, I will start with an introduction, and I will try to introduce who social wasps are. And in particular, I will give you some information of a group of social wasps, which are paper wasps, because these are this is the group to which the species that the group in Florence with I worked together during my PhD, and I kept collaborating, is working mostly. So then I will try to understand and to answer the question if wasps use vibrations, touching these four areas. So the production, the perception, the transmission, and the function of vibration in social wasps. And doing so, I will both listing what we know from literature in general in social wasps, and at the same time, I will also give some information about what we recorded, what we discovered in a specific species of social wasp. And then I will conclude and give some ideas for the future projects and future studies. So to start, who social wasps are? Well, when we think about social wasps in general, all the people think about the annoying part. Like yellow jackets or wasps, whenever you eat outside, you have a picnic, there are usually these annoying insects coming to your food and not letting you eat in peace. But well, social wasps lately have been recognized to serve a lot of different services to the ecosystem. In mainly all the areas of ecosystem services. So they are very useful as predators. They serve as pollinators, but also in medicine or in conservation of biodiversity, because they're very good bioindicators. So I really encourage you to look more in this review that just came out in Biological Reviews from Brock et al., which is a really interesting topic, like why we always considered wasps something to try to keep far from us and instead are so useful for the ecosystem. When I refer to social wasps, I in particular think about three subfamilies of the Vespidae family, which are the Vespidae, the Polistes, and the Stenogastrines. So these three subfamilies represent all the species of social wasp that we know. And for social, what I mean is the definition of eusocial species. So species that live in colonies. This means groups where more than one generation of adults overlap and show reproductive division of labor. This means that there is a differentiation in caste where there is one individual that reproduces and other individuals, adult individuals, that do not reproduce but help the reproductive individuals. The classic example are honeybees with the presence of the queen and the worker in the hive. In wasp, the situation is a little bit different because there is a very differentiated variability in the expression of sociality. So we have species that are highly eusocial, like honeybees, where the castes are very well and morphologically differentiated. So there's no way that a queen cannot reproduce or that a worker can reproduce. But there are also species that are social, but with a flexible physiological caste. This means that there are individuals that can help, can act as worker, but at the same time, they can also reproduce themselves. And this is one of the reasons why social wasps became a key group in which to study the evolution of sociality, because we have a sort of linearity and all sorts of degrees of sociality. And living in colonies, so living in groups, poses a series of challenges that animals need to face. For example, they need to find a way to share in the group the food resources. And they also need to organize their work to defend the colony in a collaborative way, in a collective way. And also dividing the reproduction labor, it's not that easy. You need to assess who is the individual that is going to reproduce and who are the individuals that are gonna be workers. So all these challenges are usually assessed through communication. And this is why they have been so much studied for communication. And also, this is the key point of why it's so interesting to study biotremology of social wasps, because up to now, the main communication channel that has been studied and considered in social wasps is chemical communication. We know that they use alarm pheromones that are present in the venom. We know that they use specific hydrocarbons on their cuticle to recognize individuals that are from the same species, from a different species, but even members of the same colony. Lately, there have been some evidences that also visual signals are used to recognize individuals inside a colony. So also the visual communication have started to become more appealing to the people that study social wasps. But very, very few notions are known about the vibrational communication. To go more into detail about the species that I studied, that we studied with the group I collaborated with, it's part of the Polistes group, the Polistes species. This group is called paper wasps because they build a nest of wood fibers, so a sort of paper material. It's very light. And this group is extremely flexible in caste differentiation. So the differences that I told you before in this group are very, very well represented. There is usually 1 or 2 foundresses that found the colony together, the nest at the beginning of spring. They start building the nest, laying the eggs. One of the individuals becomes the reproductive individual, and all the others that are gonna come later and hatch from the eggs laid in spring will be the workers. They help the reproductive individual to lay more eggs and to rear other individuals. At the end of the summer, the colony just give females and males that are gonna mate at the end of summer. The males are gonna die almost immediately, whereas the females are gonna survive over winter and then they will be ready to start a new colony. So they make this annual cycle, and every year they build a new nest with new material. When they establish the hierarchy that I previously mentioned, so when they have to found a colony, usually the social environment is one of the features, is one of the parameters that they use to establish who is going to be the reproductive individual and who instead is going to be the worker. So there are a lot of aggressive behaviors that become more ritualized during the spring, while the hierarchy is established. But all this behavioral interaction, they at the same time are influenced and influence the individual traits at the physiological level, at the morphological level. So there is this plasticity of behavior and physiology that works together to establish who is going to be the reproductive in the colony. So let's go to the hot topic of this seminar. If social wasps, beside chemical communication, beside visual signals, do they use also vibrational signals? As I mentioned before, and as I reviewed in in a chapter that is going to be part of the next book of the Biotremology series that will come out soon, I think, I hope. I divided what we know, the literature, in 4 areas. And today I'm going to also present some experimental data that we have about the production, the transmission, and the function of vibrations. About the production, what we know is that there are a lot of species in all the subfamilies of the social wasps that use oscillatory behavior. By oscillatory behavior, what I mean is that there has been someone noticing that at least one species, at least some individual in that species, were doing a behavior that potentially may induce in the substrate some sort of vibration because they vibrate or they oscillate the body while standing on the substrate. And in the brackets, you see the number of species that have been observed to perform this oscillatory behavior. So in total, it's 52 species, well spread among all the groups. The way they do and the way this oscillatory behavior have been described is tremendously variable. So everyone used in literature different terms and different description trying to describe what the wasp was doing on the nest. But we can recognize 3 main ways that wasps vibrate or oscillate on the nest. The first one is tremulation. I'm gonna show you a video. Let's see if it works. Okay, like in this example, the wasp is vibrating the wings. It's touching the substrate just with the legs, but it's vibrating the entire body. And this potentially in literature has been considered a behavior that can induce vibration in the substrate. Another way is drumming the substrate. And this is very clear in this video. Here you see a wasp that is beating the nest with the abdomen, really like a drum. And this video was recorded by us using a video camera and a laser vibrometer. So what you heard is the recording of a laser. Another way that have been described, maybe one of the first that have been not only described as behavior, but also recorded with accelerometer and described as vibrations, so as surface bone vibrations, is the scraping of mandibles of hornets' larvae inside the nest. So this was recorded with a microphone. I found this video on YouTube because it's not mine. But we know that this scraping of the mandibles on the wall of the cell also induces in the nest not only a sound, but also a vibrations. And actually, we know that is the vibrational part that is used in hornets as a hunger signal by the larvae. So the larvae are calling for food. They're calling the adults, scraping the walls of the nest. And if we put together with the picture, the figure that I showed you before of the cladogram, if we also try to divide the different behavior and how they have been described in the different species and the different groups, we see that they are very well spread. Probably the only one that is just in 2 groups, Vespidae and the Piponini, which are part of the Polistes, is the scraping, which is the most rare. But about tremulation and drumming, basically wherever there was a description of some wasp doing some sort of oscillatory behavior, it was involving tremulation or drumming. So going to what we did, the first thing that we tried to do was to record vibration on a nest of Polistes dominula. Polistes dominula is probably the species that is more common in Polistes species, and that has been more extensively studied since the 40s of last century. We used a laser Doppler vibrometer together with a video camera. So the video camera was focused below the nest, from below, watching what was going on in the nest. And the laser was pointed instead on the back of the nest, because it's the place where usually there are less adults or less wasps moving. And so they were not going too much below the laser and making too much noise to record what was going on. And this is what we got. So basically, whatever the wasp was doing on the nest was inducing vibrations. This is maybe pretty obvious, but it was the first time that all the behavior were described or were recorded of a wasp moving on a paper nest. I'm going to show you the video here. And this is a wasp that is inspecting the cell. So it's going in each cell, looking at the larvae. And this behavior that was doing, this oscillating behavior with the abdomen on the nest, is what was called in literature abdominal wagging. And the abdominal wagging, here in red, is probably one of the more recognizable cues, vibrational cues, while we recorded, because it's pretty different from the background noise. It's not just incidental vibrations, but there is a sort of rhythm. We could recognize a pulse repetition time in the recordings. And it's very consistent what we found with some recordings that were already done by Brennan in 2007, but he used some accelerometer instead of a laser, and he was cutting out a lot of low vibrations. So actually the dominant frequencies that we found were around 40 or 50 hertz, so even below 100 hertz. Instead, he was usually describing everything just above 100 and ignoring whatever was below. Another behavior that was recorded by us was the wing ventilation. So the video that I showed you before of a wasp ventilating the wings, but staying in the same spot on the nest, it actually induced vibrations into the nest. And it induced this kind of vibration here that you can see in this figure with a clear harmonic structure. So already just recording one species with the laser for some time, a few minutes per day, 15 minutes per day, we were able to find either tremulation and ramming of the substrate. We also tried to record the nest when there were no adults in the nest to see if the larvae were doing anything, like it happens for hornets. And we were able to detect some scraping. So either from the vibrational recording, from the audio file, but also from the video, and putting them together, we were able to see actually the larvae like scraping the nest, striking the wall cell. But these vibrations were very, very low in amplitude, like compared to the vibrations that were usually recorded with just one adult on the nest. They were completely masked when there was an adult moving on the nest. But yeah, so we also got the third production mechanism of scraping. About perception and what we know for social wasps, it's very, very little. I think there was just 3 species of social wasps that have been studied for the reception of vibrational signals for mechanoreceptors. And as other social insects, as honeybees, as ants, the number of Sculopedia is very similar. They have subgenual organs, they have Johnston's organs. So clearly they can perceive vibrations. And at the same time, there is no data about the sound perception. So something that in literature is often found for social insects is that they do not use vibrations. No, they use sounds to communicate. Well, it's for us, probably for this audience that studies vibrational communication, is why not vibrations and why sound, especially when we have no clue at this stage that they can perceive sound, but we know for sure that they perceive vibrations. So yeah, this is probably less interesting for this audience, more for who doesn't know much about vibration perception. About the propagation of vibrations in the nest, well, the shape of the nest is extremely variable in social wasps. These are 3 examples from the 3 different subfamilies. So you have in A an example of a Polistes nest, which is a single comb attached to the substrate above, and it's open. Whereas on the right, you have the nest of hornets, of Vespidae. Usually these are huge nests that are closed and they have multiple layers inside. And then there are the last group, the Stenogastrinae. They make very peculiar nests. This is a closed nest with this weird shape. They're pretty small, so more similar to the Polistes species nest than hornets. We don't know anything basically about the transmission into wasp nest of vibrations, but we know something about honeybees and the hive. And from what we know of the honeybees, we can hypothesize that the comb of social wasp should be a good substrate to transmit vibration, because usually the different layers, even if they're multiple, they're free on all sides. And in the hive of honeybees, when the comb is free, it usually vibrates better than a framed comb. Moreover, the surface of social wasp's nest is striped. It has a rough pattern. And this enables, for example, the scraping and the production of vibration just by scraping the surface compared to the wax, for example, of honeybees. And more than one comb is present, they're usually interconnected to each other. This is an example of the hornet nest. And you can see that from the side, there are multiple layers, multiple combs, but they are all interconnected in the middle. So this would allow the transmission of vibration. And also the external envelope gives an additional layers that connects all part of the colony. What we try to do, what we wanted to see is how the abdominal walking event, which is the vibrational cue that has been described mainly in literature and that we were able to record, how does it propagate into the nest? So we took 8 nests, very small nests, because it's at the big. They usually tend to perform mainly the abdominal walking at the beginning of the season in spring, when the nests are pretty small. So we wanted to replicate this situation. And with the shaker, we played back the abdominal walking, either putting the shaker in contact with the edge of the nest, so what is called external stimulus in the figure, or in the center of the nest. And then we recorded with the laser in a different position at the point where the shaker was placed and farther away. So where the numbers are in the figures. What we found is that if the shaker was in the center of the nest, the signal was pretty much consistent, especially in the temporal parameters. So of course the duration was the same, and also the rate of the abdominal walking was consistent, but the intensity seems to get higher at the edge of the nest. And this was even more clear when the stimulus, when the playback was done on the edge of the nest, because as you can see, the red circles, so the recording that were done in the middle of the nest, are much lower in intensity, and also the frequency band, so the span of frequency, since a broadband signal, was lower in the center, and then it increases again at the edge. About the function, so this is probably the most interesting part of our studies, and also the more interesting for curious people is, okay, but so we know that they do vibrations. We know that they perceive vibrations. We know that the vibrations can spread pretty well in the substrate of the nest, which is where mainly all the activity of the colony take place. But why do they do vibrations? So what is the meaning? So what I found in literature is that, unfortunately, even if we have the description of these behaviors in 52 species, only in 5 studies, and for the same number of species, so only for 5 species, the function of vibration have been tested using playbacks. In all the other species, we have no idea of the actual function. We have a lot of hypotheses. So the behaviors have been, of course, described in conjunction with a specific context. And so just considering the context, the behavioral context in which this behavior were performed, we divided them in 4 areas, which are also the 4 main challenges that living in social structure colonies pose. So the defense of the colony, the recruitment of resources or individuals of the colony, dominance, so the assessing the dominant individuals compared to subordinates, and the communication between adults and larvae in the nest. And when I talk about communication between adult and larvae, it's not just adults that are communicating to larvae, but is also larvae communicating to adults, as I showed you before with the hornets larvae that call for the adults scraping the nest. Mainly all these different contexts are well represented in the different groups. We find them everywhere. For the defense and for the dominance, we have no test at all with playback. The only studies that have been done in the recruitment context and in the adult larvae communication. And for recruitment, it was only done in Vespidae. Whereas the adult and larvae communication was done also in Polistes, and we actually did part of it. So what we wanted to investigate again was mainly the abdominal wagging in Polistes dominula, which was considered to be used in the dominance assessment among adults. So part of those behaviors that occur among fundraises at the beginning of spring to establish who is going to be the individual to reproduce and who is going to be the subordinate that do not reproduce. This was supported by the fact that usually the abdominal wagging is mainly performed by the dominant female. However, there are also other 3 reasons why it was weird that the abdominal wagging was only involved in the dominance assessment among adults, because also single fundraise, so even if there is just one adult on the nest, it performs abdominal wagging and there are no other adults to perceive it. It can be done also by fundraises without the presence of workers and before their emergence. But there must be at least 1 larvae at the 3rd instar before they start to do abdominal wagging. So there were some clues saying, well, maybe this vibration is used to communicate, is used by adults to communicate with the larvae. And Larvae in social insects in general, also in social wasps, they usually do trophallaxis with adults. This trophallaxis is the exchange of liquid nutritious food between the larvae and the adults, and is considered to help in maintain the sociality of the group. However, there were very confused hypotheses about the involvement of abdominal wagging for the trophallaxis behavior, because some studies say that the abdominal wagging was stimulating the larvae to release saliva, so to do trophallaxis. And other studies, more recent studies, were saying, no, actually the data suggests that the abdominal wagging is inhibiting the larvae from releasing saliva. So we wanted to test and say, okay, let's use a playback that it has never been done, and let's see what the larvae are going to do. We took nests, we took out the adults, we put in contact a shaker with the support system of the nest, and we gave a vibrational playback for 2 minutes to the nest. We played back either the abdominal wagging or a white noise or no playback, so a silence. And then we measured how many movements were the larvae doing inside the cell when stimulated by the playback, and how much saliva they were releasing. And what we found is that the movement of larvae increased with abdominal wagging, but the amount of saliva is exactly the same among all 3 treatments. So what we concluded is that they can perceive, of course, the larvae can perceive the vibration of the abdominal wagging because the reaction was different from the abdominal wagging and the white noise, so they can discriminate between the two, but they react increasing their body movement and not releasing more or less saliva. So actually our data do not support the salivary regulation hypothesis at all. So what can be the function? Well, our idea is that they tend to move more in order to attract the adult and to let the adult inspect and give the food to the larvae that are moving more inside the cell. Should we at this point completely discard the idea of the abdominal wagging as a dominant signal or as a dominant cue? Maybe not. And some insights are coming from the study of a peculiar species of paper wasps. So paper wasps have inside them, even if they're social insects, some species that are called social parasites that do not have at all the worker caste. So these species just have reproductive individuals, either females or males. How they can build a nest, how they can have a colony defending them if they do not have workers? Well, they just steal the nest of a host species, in our case, Polistes dominula, and they take over, they usurp the nest of the host species, often in a very aggressive way, fighting with the queen of the nest and either killing or letting the queen go away from the colony. And they take over, they take the role of the dominant female, they start laying their own eggs into the nest, and they let the workers of the host species rear their own brood. Why studying this association, this social parasite and host system can be useful to study vibrational communication? Well, because the social parasite perform a behavior that is very similar to the abdominal wagging of the host species. Here you have the abdominal wagging recorded with the laser on the left, and the abdominal drumming, that is the behavior of the social parasite, on the right, always recorded with the same laser vibrometer. And the behavior is similar, but not exactly the same. The difference is that when in the abdominal wagging, the wasp is oscillating the behavior in the same plane of the nest. And while doing this oscillation, it eats the surface of the nest. Whereas the abdominal drumming of the social parasite is exactly a drumming, a beating of the nest perpendicularly to the surface of the nest. Does this have a difference in the production of vibrations? Yes, because the parasite, which is Polistes sulcifer, the species, induce vibrations that are more intense on the nest and with a longer duration, so for a longer time. And what is interesting is that in the parasitized colony, the individual of the host species seem to perform an abdominal wagging, which is less intense and shorter compared to what they usually do when the parasite is not present in the colony. So to conclude, we can say that we were able to describe all the three mechanisms of production that have been observed in social wasps. All three of them have been found also in Polistes dominula, and each one of them induce vibrations into the nest. The nest seems to be a very good substrate for transmission of surface-borne waves. And probably the fact that it transmits so well into the nest and the amplitude increase over the edges can have some implication for the function of these vibrations, because they reach all the individuals on the nest in the same way. And vibrations have been observed in all four behavioral contexts that I described, but for Polistes, their role has been tested with playbacks only in adult and broad communication. So, of course, I think that with this review, we were able to demonstrate that vibrational communication in social wasps is very important and shouldn't be overlooked anymore as it has been done so far. However, we need much more measurement of the surface-borne component of vibrational behaviors, because this was just the beginning of a study and just for one species. But for example, the fact that we were able to see how is the spectrogram of the abdominal wagging let us say that it's a drumming behavior and not a tremulation. And this was in discussion before of our recording. So I think this is very important. The mechanism of perception and propagation into the substrate needs still to be investigated in many more species. And of course, we need playback tests, because I think this is the only way we can actually assess the function of vibrations and if they have a communicative function. And last but not least, social wasps have been one of the few models in insects, at least, in which the action of vibration have demonstrated to be relevant and to affect the physiology of the insect. So the vibrations in one species, at least of social wasps, can affect the expression of genes and change the larval fate in caste determination. So larvae that are exposed to vibrations become workers, whereas larvae that are not exposed to vibration becomes reproductive individuals. And this is something that has been done only in one species, but I think it's extremely interesting because it could be the key to sociality in social wasps. And with this, I would like to thank all my collaborators, of course, during these years, and in particular, Dr. Alessandro Cini, because he was the first one to think about use a laser vibrometer on a nest of Polistes dominula, and he made all of us collaborate and work together to find out our results so far. So thank you, and if you have any question, I'm glad to take them.